After the construction of some heavily armed floating factory stacks that the Russian Navy had accidentally commissioned and named Navarin, the Russian Navy decided to follow on with a ship that was going to be built for the Black Sea Fleet. This would originally be based on an enlarged version of Navarin, which was now a Baltic Fleet battleship, with some improvements planned for armour and armament. Since they were able to base their work off of existing drawings, the design for this new ship was made in remarkable time. It only took 4 months between the start of the design drawings and their approval. The ship was named Tri Sviatitelia. I think I probably got that horribly wrong, but anyway, it means the three holy hierarchs, and the ship began construction in early August 1891. Coming in at 371 feet long at the waterline and 370 feet overall, she had a beam of just over 73 feet and a draft of just over 28 feet, displacing just over 13,400 tons, which was about 800 tons more than she was actually designed to displace, as her design displacement was around 12,500 tons. This made her considerably larger than Navarin by about 23 feet in length, 6 foot in beam, and 3,000 tons in displacement. Propulsion came courtesy of a pair of 3-cylinder vertical triple expansion engines that had been built by a British firm with a total design power output of 10,600 indicated horsepower, driving a pair of screws. On sea trials, the power plant proved a little bit more capable than designed at 11,300 indicated horsepower, and the top speed commensurately went up to 16.5 knots versus a design speed of 16. Whilst large and somewhat lacking in the funnel department compared to her predecessor, there was a certain resemblance to Navarin, but the taller funnels and masts made her look a little bit more like a ship and less like a building. Although she completed heavily overweight, she had a reasonable freeboard for the time of around 14 feet, although you wouldn't want to go into rough seas with it. The main battery was made up of 4 12-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets, one fore and one aft, with the guns being a newer and more powerful pattern than those mounted on previous Russian capital ships. Although the large circular turrets were outwardly similar to those found on Navarin, internally they were quite different. They were hydraulically powered, the ammunition was fed by electric hoists, and for a first time in the Russian Navy, the guns were also balanced so they didn't affect the ship's trim as they were trained around. They had a fairly good arc of fire, but the rate of fire itself was a little bit slow at around 1 round every minute and 3/4, up to 1 round every 2 minutes. With an ammunition allowance of 75 rounds per gun, that meant over 2 hours of continuous fire. The secondary battery was made up of 8 single 6-inch guns that were mounted in armoured casemates, but these were somewhat cramped. Their arcs of fire were also relatively limited, as even the end 6-inch guns were unable to fire axially, i.e. fore or aft. They were purely broadside weapons. To compensate for this, there were 4 single 4.7-inch guns mounted above the 6-inch battery at the corners of the superstructure, giving them fairly wide arcs of fire. These guns were, however, unprotected and therefore seemed to be intended for anti-torpedo boat work. A rather impressive 50 smaller caliber weapons, mostly 37mm but with 10 47mm in there as well, were scattered all over the ship for similar anti-torpedo boat exercises. 6 small torpedo tubes were also carried, 1 fore, 1 aft, and 2 on either side, all of which were above the water except for the forward broadside tubes. The ship was unique for the time in the fleet, as unlike previous Russian battleships, it would be the first to use the Harvey type of armour. The armour itself was imported, made by Vickers in Britain, as well as a couple of French firms, Schneider et Cie and Saint-Chamond. Unlike many navies, which took the chance to use a stronger armour material to make the armour thinner for the same level of protection and thus save weight, the result of this upgrade in armour type was the thickest armour on any Russian ship up to that point, which was part of the reason its displacement was so high. The belt varied from a minimum of 16 inches to a maximum of 18 inches thick, with the turrets having 16 inches of armour and a deck that was 3 inches thick at its maximum point. The ship was launched on the 12th of November 1893, entering service officially in 1895 but practically in mid-1896, as her sea trials didn't even start until the last quarter of 1895. In 1899, she became the first capital ship in the world to be fitted with a radio, although it was fairly short range, about 3 miles, which meant that communication could equally be done with large signals or searchlights if the weather was good, albeit that these searchlights took a few years before they decided exactly where they were going to actually be on the ship. The engines and electrical generators were constant sources of problems during her service life, the former being maintenance nightmares and the latter simply too small to generate enough current for all the electrical items that could be found on board. After an involvement in the battleship Potemkin incident and a major refit in 1912, which removed almost any gun smaller than a 6-inch in favour of expanding the 6-inch battery with 6 extra weapons, whilst also cutting down the superstructure and improving the elevation of the main battery, some of which resulted in a boost of speed as she dropped in weight, the ship next saw action in World War I, fighting off the battlecruiser Goeben off Cape Sarik in November 1914 in concert with a number of other Russian pre-dreadnoughts, and most of the rest of her wartime service consisted of bombarding Ottoman fortifications with one more abortive pursuit of the enemy battlecruiser. She was refitting in Sevastopol during the February Revolution of 1917, and still immobile there, she was captured by the Germans when they took the city in May 1918, and then handed over to the Allies in December 1918 after the armistice. When the British, who'd been helping out the White Russians, decided to leave Crimea in the spring of 1919, they couldn't take the ship with them, and so instead they wrecked her engines to stop the Bolsheviks using them. The ship then changed hands between the two sides in the Russian Civil War several times, until the area was fully occupied by the Bolsheviks at the end of 1920. The ship was then scrapped in 1923, although in the chaos of early communist Russia, no one actually realised that she needed to be removed from the Navy list until about 2 years later.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.